My name is Daphne Lee. I'm 33 years old. I live alone in a modest two-bedroom condo in San Diego, and I'm a senior engineer at a mid-sized biotech firm that most people haven't heard of. I'm not flashy. I don't drive a luxury car or post vacation photos in Bali. I pack my own lunch, water my houseplants, and max out my Roth IRA like it's a religion. I wasn't always this way, this cautious, this measured. I used to believe that love came without conditions, especially from family. That if you were kind and loyal and worked hard, you'd earn your place and be seen for who you truly are. Turns out, I was wrong about a lot of things, especially when it came to my family. I was never the favorite. Let me get that out of the way. Not the golden child. Not the one who got the biggest slice of cake or the loudest applause at the dinner table. That was always my older sister, Heather. The bright one. The charming one. She had this way of turning heads when she walked into a room, big laugh, bigger presence. She could cry on cue and get out of any trouble with a single bat of her lashes. Me? I was the background music to her spotlight. Even when we were kids, it was obvious. Heather got a brand new mountain bike for her 10th birthday. I got her old one with the training wheels still attached. When she forgot her homework, my mom would march it to school like a knight delivering a sword. When I forgot mine, I got a lecture on responsibility and a week without screen time. But I adapted. I learned how to survive by being quiet, self-sufficient, forgettable. And as much as it stung sometimes, I didn't resent her. Not really. Not until I realized how deep the favoritism ran and how much it would cost me. I've always been good with numbers. Not like my dad, who was an accountant and viewed the world through spreadsheets. But I understood value. Systems. I saw how small, steady habits created security. Maybe it was my way of finding control in a home where love felt rationed. I started investing young, 22, with my first real paycheck. While Heather was blowing through her grad school loans on designer bags and destination weddings, I was researching mutual funds and calculating compound interest. It wasn't glamorous, but it gave me a sense of power. Something that belonged solely to me. Still, I never talked about it. Not because I was ashamed, but because, in our family, talking about your wins was bragging, and silence was interpreted as humility. Or worse, insignificance. I used to wonder if my parents even knew what I did for a living. Biotech engineering wasn't as easy to cheer for as, say, Heather's marketing job at that big cosmetics brand. Once, at a barbecue, my mother introduced me to a neighbor as our daughter who works in a lab or something. I had just been published in Nature Biotechnology the month before. But I smiled. I always smiled. That was my job in the family. Until the day I didn't. It happened after Heather's third loan. This time it was $5,000 for a business idea she never bothered to fully explain. "I just need a little help," she'd said, eyes glossy, voice trembling. "Please, Daph." I had said yes, like always. Because it was easier than the guilt. Because saying no in our house was the equivalent of setting fire to the dinner table. 3 weeks later, I saw her Instagram story. Rooftop cocktails, new shoes, a flight to Tulum. I didn't confront her. Not at first. I just sat with it. With the quiet boiling feeling that comes when you realize you've been made a fool of. Then Mom called me 2 days later. "She told me you made her feel like a beggar," she said, tone cold. "Heather says you guilted her over a small loan." That wasn't very sisterly, Daphne. I sat on the edge of my bed, phone pressed to my cheek, heart thudding. "I didn't guilt her," I said quietly. "I just asked when she might pay me back." There was a pause. Then my mother said something I'll never forget. "You've always been so uptight about money. It's not like you're struggling. You make good money, don't you?" And that's when it snapped. The years of being overlooked, used, misunderstood. The way Heather's recklessness was framed as passion, while my discipline was called stinginess. I'd taken it a levery, sideways comment, every secondhand gift, every, "Oh, Daphne will understand," and buried it deep inside, where it hardened into something sharp. So I pulled up the app. The one I never showed anyone. My investment portfolio. Over a decade of saving, growing, reinvesting. Quietly, diligently. 3.4 million. I took a screenshot. Opened a new message. Typed her name. Attached the image. And wrote just one word. Oops. I didn't think she'd respond. But oh, she did. And what followed? Well, that's where the real story begins. It was a Sunday afternoon in late March when I received the call that would unravel the fragile threads holding my family together. The sun filtered through the blinds, casting long, golden stripes across the hardwood floor of my living room. I was nestled on the couch, a cup of chamomile tea cradled in my hands, the soft hum of the dishwasher in the background providing a comforting rhythm to the quiet day. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, its screen illuminating with Heather's name. A knot formed in my stomach. It was rare for her to call me directly. Our interactions were usually limited to family gatherings or group texts. I hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hey, Heather," I greeted, trying to keep my voice neutral. "Daphne?" she began, her tone unusually brisk. "I need a favor." I sighed inwardly, bracing myself. "What is it?" "I'm in a bit of a bind," she continued. "I invested in this boutique fitness studio with some friends. It's a great opportunity, but we're short on funds to cover the initial costs. I was hoping you could lend me $10,000. The audacity of her request left me momentarily speechless. "Heather, that's a significant amount of money." "I know," she said quickly. "But it's a solid investment. We'll be profitable in no time, and I'll pay you back within 6 months." I closed my eyes, the weight of years of similar requests pressing down on me. "Heather, I've helped you out before. Remember the $5,000 for your last venture? You never paid me back." "That was different," she snapped. "This time is legit. Besides, you're doing well, aren't you? You can afford it." Her words stung, not because of their content, but because of the entitlement behind them. "It's not about whether I can afford it," I replied calmly. "It's about the principle." There was a pause on the other end. "Fine," she said curtly. "Forget I asked." She hung up before I could respond, leaving me staring at the phone, a mix of frustration and sadness swirling within me. Later that evening, my mother called. "Daphne, I just spoke with Heather," she began, her voice tinged with disappointment. "She told me you refused to help her with her business." I took a deep breath. "Mom, she's already borrowed money from me and hasn't paid it back. I can't keep enabling her." "She's your sister," my mother admonished. "Family helps each other." I felt a familiar sense of injustice rising. Does that help only go one way? I've been supporting myself since college, never asked for anything, and yet I'm always expected to bail Heather out. "You're being selfish," she said sharply. "Heather is trying to build something, and you're holding her back." The call ended with a cold silence, and I was left feeling like the villain in a story where I had always been the supporting character, never the protagonist. The next day, I received a group text from Heather. "Heather, just so everyone knows, Daphne's too stingy to support her own sister's dreams. Guess money really does change people." I stared at the message, my heart pounding. The group chat included our extended family cousins, aunts, uncles. The public shaming was deliberate, calculated. I typed a response, then deleted it. I repeated this process several times, each message either too defensive or too aggressive. Finally, I settled on a simple reply. "Daphne, I'm sorry you feel that way, Heather. I've always tried to be supportive, but I can't continue to be taken advantage of." The silence that followed was deafening. Over the next few days, I noticed a shift in the family's demeanor. Calls went unanswered, messages ignored. I was being ostracized, painted as the antagonist in Heather's narrative. One evening, I received a letter in the mail. It was from my parents, a formal note expressing their disappointment in my behavior and informing me that they were reconsidering the terms of their will. The implication was clear: my refusal to support Heather had consequences. I sat at my kitchen table, the letter trembling in my hands. The sense of betrayal was overwhelming. I had always been the dependable one, the responsible daughter who never caused trouble. Yet, here I was, being punished for setting boundaries. In the days that followed, I reflected on the pattern that had defined my relationship with Heather and my parents. I had been the safety net, the one who picked up the pieces, while Heather pursued her whims without accountability. My compliance had been mistaken for consent, my silence for agreement. It was time to change the narrative. I gathered documentation of the loans I had given Heather over the years, the unpaid debts, the messages where she promised repayment. I compiled a detailed account of my financial support, the sacrifices I had made. Then, I wrote a letter to my parents. Dear Mom and Dad, I have always strived to be the daughter you could rely on, the one who managed her life without burdening you. I have supported Heather financially on multiple occasions, believing that I was helping her find her footing. However, this pattern has become unsustainable and detrimental to my well-being. I understand your disappointment, but I hope you can see that my decision to set boundaries is not an act of selfishness, but one of self-preservation. With love, Daphne. I sent the letter, unsure of what response, if any, I would receive. A week later, I received a reply from my father. Dear Daphne, we were unaware of the extent of your support for Heather. Your letter has given us a new perspective. We apologize for our earlier judgment and hope to have an open discussion soon. Love, Dad. It was a small step, but a significant one. For the first time, my voice was being heard, my experiences acknowledged. I realized that standing up for myself didn't mean severing ties, it meant redefining them. It meant asserting my worth and refusing to be diminished. And so, I began the process of healing, of rebuilding relationships on the foundation of mutual respect and understanding. I wish I could say I was surprised, or even angry, when she asked for the money, but the truth is I wasn't. What I felt, more than anything, was tired. Tired in that deep, soul-heavy way that doesn't come from lack of sleep or overwork, but from years of being the responsible one, the fallback plan. The quiet sister who was easy to guilt and even easier to forget. That day, when Heather asked me for $10,000 like it was no more than a casual errand, I wasn't shocked, I was numb, as if my body had prepared itself for this inevitability long before the words even left her lips. I told her I'd think about it, because saying no outright felt like inviting a war, and I didn't have the energy to hold the line in that moment. But the second I hung up, I felt the quiet suffocation that came from being expected to keep the family functioning without recognition or thanks. I stood in my living room, phone still warm in my hand, and for a brief, bitter second, I wanted to disappear. I wanted to be the daughter who messed up and still got defended. I wanted to be the sister who borrowed recklessly and was still adored. I wanted, more than anything, to matter in the same way Heather did, to be seen, not just used. I didn't give her the money. Not this time. Instead, I sent a polite but firm text the next morning, saying I couldn't afford to loan out that much and that I hoped she understood. I stared at the blinking cursor longer than I should have, wondering if I should add a smiley face, soften the message, apologize for her disappointment, because years of playing peacemaker had trained me to cushion every truth with sugar. Her reply came 5 minutes later. Wow. So now you're selfish and cheap? Got it. And just like that, the numbness cracked, and something sharper broke through. I didn't answer. Not immediately. What could I say that wouldn't be twisted and thrown back at me in a group chat with our mother or reinterpreted as coldness by people who'd never once asked how I was doing? Who only ever came around when something needed fixing or funding or forgiving? I stared at the message, reread it again and again, and instead of responding, I scrolled through my photos, pictures of me at work, at home, with colleagues who actually appreciated me, friends who didn't drain me, and I let the truth sink in. I didn't owe her anything. Not anymore. But even knowing that didn't make the hurt disappear. Because a week later, I found out that she'd gone to our parents again and told them her version of the story. That I had changed, that I was cold, and that maybe success had gone to my head. I found this out, of course, not directly, but through our mother, who called me on a Tuesday evening while I was still at my desk, finishing up a client report that could potentially lead to a major clinical trial partnership. "You've always had such a hard time letting people in, Daphne," she said, her voice laced with that familiar condescension that never sounded quite cruel but always landed like a slap. "Maybe if you were a bit more generous, people wouldn't feel so hurt." Now, I stared at the wall, hand frozen over my keyboard, pulse rising with that familiar cocktail of rage and grief and resignation. "I am generous," I said quietly. "Just not with people who manipulate me." There was a silence. Then she sighed. "You know, Heather said you'd react like this, that you'd make it all about yourself." And that was when the real pain bloomed, not sharp and sudden, but slow and aching, like bruises blooming under skin that had already been struck too many times. Because what she meant, what she'd always meant, was that Heather's feelings were real, but mine were a burden. That my boundaries were cruelty, but Heather's needs were love. I wanted to scream, but all I could manage was, "Why is it always me who has to bend?" Another silence. And then, "Because you're stronger, Daphne. You don't fall apart like she does." As if being strong meant I didn't need comfort. As if holding everything together for years made me unworthy of tenderness. I ended the call after that, politely, because I had no interest in being the villain in a story I never wrote. That night, I sat in the dark, knees pulled to my chest, surrounded by the quiet hum of my apartment, and I cried not loud, not dramatically, but silently. In that way where the body trembles and the tears fall like rain you forgot to prepare for. I cried for the girl who spent her whole life trying to be enough. I cried for the woman who learned to equate invisibility with peace. And I cried for the space between who I was and who I'd been forced to become. Because in that moment, I realized something that had been growing inside me for years but never fully bloomed until now. Love, in my family, had terms, and I had stopped meeting them. And yet, even in my sorrow, a seed of something fierce began to sprout, a small, stubborn voice that whispered, "This isn't your fault. You deserve better." I went to bed that night hollowed out, but clear. And that clarity, as painful as it was, would become the foundation of everything that followed. You'd think that after that night, after the silence and the tears and the quiet, aching realization that my family would never see me as more than a utility, that something would shift, that maybe the worst was behind me and I could finally start detaching without guilt. But pain, I've learned, has a way of compounding, and sometimes the breaking doesn't come all at once but slowly, in layers, like peeling skin after a sunburn, each new wound a little rawer than the last. It started small, as these things always do, with a family group chat that I'd been silently lurking in for months. The kind that only ever lit up when Heather had something to announce or when my mother wanted to share church fundraiser updates. I'd stopped engaging much because every time I typed something, it either got ignored or someone would casually deflect it in favor of something Heather had said, even if it was just a picture of her brunch. But then came the message that made my stomach tighten in that now familiar way. "We're thinking about adjusting the will," my mother wrote, as casually as if she were talking about rearranging the living room furniture. "Heather and Daniel have been talking about having kids soon, and we want to make sure everything's in place for the next generation. Just a heads up." No explanation. No question. No invitation to discuss. Just adjusting the will. I blinked at the screen, my fingers trembling slightly as I reread the message. My parents had never been wealthy, not in the extravagant sense, but they owned the house outright, the same one we grew up in, and a cabin in Montana that had been passed down from my grandfather, a small but meaningful inheritance that my dad had always referred to as our legacy. And for as long as I could remember, there'd been talk of splitting things evenly between Heather and me, that it was only fair, that families should always stay balanced when it came to money. But now, because Heather might have children, I was being pushed aside, quietly, without even the decency of a conversation. I sat on my couch for a long time that evening, staring at the last message like it was some kind of riddle, as if there might be a second meaning I had missed, a chance to interpret it less cruelly. I typed a response twice and deleted it both times before finally sending. "What does that mean?" Adjusting it how? No one answered for 2 days. And when the reply came, it wasn't from my mom, it was from Heather. It just makes sense. You're single. You don't have kids, you probably won't. You have your career. Daniel and I are building a family legacy. We're just trying to plan smartly. The words hit me like ice water down the spine, and not just the assumption, not just the implication that because I hadn't chosen motherhood or marriage I was somehow less worthy, but the way she said it so plainly, like it was a math equation she'd already solved. You equals alone, us equals future. And no one, not my mother, not my father, not even an uncle or cousin stood up for me. Not even privately. It wasn't just about money. It never had been. It was about the way I was slowly being written out of the narrative, edited out of the family story because I didn't fit the mold they preferred. I wasn't Heather, with her picture-perfect posts and holiday cards and curated life, and because of that, I was being treated like an afterthought, like a placeholder instead of a daughter. That summer, I didn't go to the lake house. I claimed I was too busy with work, and when no one pushed, no one even called to check in, I realized they hadn't noticed or hadn't cared enough to miss me. I spent the 4th of July alone, listening to distant fireworks through the open window while scrolling through photos of my parents posing with Heather and Daniel on the cabin dock. All sun-kissed smiles and matching patriotic outfits. No one even texted me a happy 4th. I was gone, and they were fine. But what hurt most wasn't the isolation, it was the contrast. Because at work, I was thriving. My colleagues respected me, my team came to me for guidance, and my supervisor had just pulled me into a high-stakes project that could redefine our clinical testing protocols. I was being trusted with real responsibility, real impact. I was seen. But at home, I was the ghost in the family album. And then came the final insult, quiet and cold as a knife. A letter arrived in the mail that fall, official, with a notary stamp and everything. It was from my parents' estate lawyer, outlining the preliminary draft of the updated distribution plan for the family trust. Heather and Daniel were now listed as primary beneficiaries. I was included only in a secondary consideration clause, meaning that if they declined or were unable to accept, then I might be included. It was right there in black and white. My erasure. I didn't even cry this time. I just folded the letter carefully, tucked it into a file in my desk drawer, and sat down at my kitchen table with a glass of wine and my laptop, staring at the blinking cursor of an empty email draft addressed to no one in particular. It was no longer about the money. It was about dignity. About the years of being talked over, written out, sidelined for choosing a different kind of life. A life built on quiet ambition instead of performance, on patience instead of entitlement. And it was in that moment, as the weight of all the injustices settled around me like fog, that something in me hardened, not bitterness, exactly, but a kind of steel will. I had let it slide for too long, rationalized their behavior as generational or circumstantial or emotional. But now I was done shrinking. I didn't know it yet, but that quiet rage would become my armor. Because they had underestimated me for the last time. You can only sit in silence for so long before it begins to rot something inside you, before the weight of being overlooked hardens into something heavier than resentment, something quieter than rage, a kind of grief for the life you thought you were building with people who you assumed would love you simply for existing. And when that grief becomes unbearable, you either surrender to it or you move, you act. You try, even if it means opening yourself to more hurt. And that's what I did because I wasn't ready to give up on them yet, even after the inheritance letter, even after being treated like a footnote in my own family. Maybe it was foolish, or maybe it was just the last echo of hope that hadn't yet been stomped out, but I still wanted recognition, not applause or admiration. Not even a thank you, just acknowledgement that I was here, that I mattered, that I wasn't just a walking ATM or a cautionary tale for choosing a different path than the one they had planned for me. So I started small. I tried to rebuild bridges that I hadn't even burned, bridges they'd set fire to, while I stood on the other side, holding buckets of water and waiting for someone to say they wanted to cross. I sent my mother flowers for her birthday that year, a beautiful bouquet of ivory lilies and pale pink peonies, hand-delivered with a note in my neatest handwriting. Thinking of you. Love, Daphne. No response, not even a text. I saw the bouquet in the background of a photo she posted the next day. Heather holding a slice of cake, Daniel's arm around her waist, Mom beaming between them. The flowers blurred in the corner like a misplaced decoration. She didn't tag me. She didn't mention me. I was a silent presence in her living room, even in absence. Still, I didn't stop. I invited them to a work gala where I was receiving an internal award for innovation, nothing grand, just a small ceremony among peers, but I thought maybe if they saw me in my world, surrounded by people who respected me, they might begin to understand. I sent the invitation 3 weeks in advance, printed and mailed it like a wedding invite, and followed up with a soft reminder over the phone. My mother hesitated, said she'd check with Dad, and that she'd ask Heather if she wanted to come too. I told her it wasn't about Heather, that I just wanted them there. They didn't show. The next morning, I got a voicemail from my dad. His voice sounded tired, like he'd just woken up. Sorry, Daph, your mom wasn't feeling well, and we had some things come up. But I'm sure you did great. You always do great things. He said it like he was reading off a script. I deleted the message after replaying it twice, unsure if I was angrier at the dismissal or the indifference. At work, they called me a rising star. My department head told me I had executive potential. Investors started including me in strategy calls, and still, none of it mattered at home. My wins didn't translate there. My achievements weren't currency in a world where charm beat competence, where being loud meant being right, where family pride was reserved for the one who made the most noise. But I kept trying. I offered to help Heather with her business idea, even after she'd insulted me. I told her I had contacts in venture science who might be interested in funding health-based fitness apps, that I could run some numbers, help her structure the pitch deck. She rolled her eyes over brunch and said, "You wouldn't get it, it's more about vibe than data." Then she changed the subject to a new watch Daniel bought her. I swallowed the humiliation. I pretended the Eggs Benedict wasn't sticking to my throat. I smiled and nodded because I still didn't want to be the sister who made scenes in public. I paid for brunch. She didn't thank me. After that, I tried one last thing, something that felt like a Hail Mary. I wrote a letter. A real letter, in ink, on thick cream paper. I wrote to my mother not as her daughter, but as a woman. I told her who I was outside the context of Heather, outside the roles they'd written me into. I told her about my work, about what it meant to design therapies that could extend lives. I told her about the nights I cried after being left out, about the loneliness of feeling invisible, about how hard I'd worked to build a life that no one in my family cared to understand. I ended it with the simplest sentence I've ever written. I just want to be seen for who I am, not who you've decided I'm not. I mailed it without expecting much. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't check the mailbox compulsively or reread it in my mind every night. I let it go, like a message in a bottle cast into a sea I no longer knew how to navigate. 2 weeks passed, then 3, then a month. No call, no reply, no acknowledgement that the words even arrived. Instead, I got a group email about Thanksgiving plans, forwarded by Heather, with a note at the bottom that said, "If Daphne decides not to make it again this year, we'll just split the grocery bill between the rest of us." As if I were a burden. As if my absence was both expected and useful. That's when I stopped trying. That's when I realized that some doors don't open no matter how softly you knock, that some families only recognize loyalty when it's loud and convenient and flattering. And mine? Mine preferred me quiet, small, uncomplaining, and invisible. So I stopped knocking. But I didn't stop growing. And, quietly, in the solitude they mistook for failure, I was building something far stronger than recognition. I was building freedom. The thing about staying quiet for so long, about swallowing every slight and ignoring every bruise you can't quite show, is that people start to think it's your natural state, that silence equals consent, that peacekeeping means weakness, and eventually they convince themselves that they're justified in treating you as the background to their main event, because you've never demanded otherwise. And then one day, without even realizing it, you wake up and the disrespect has calcified, has turned into something they no longer question. And any effort you make to claw back your dignity looks to them like rebellion. It all came to a head the weekend of my father's birthday. I hadn't been home in nearly a year, not since the inheritance letter and Heather's little aside about me not having a family legacy to protect, and yet when the invitation came through, handwritten by my mother on a floral note card and sent by post, like she was making some grand gesture, I felt that familiar ache, that tug of obligation and longing and some deep, damaged hope that maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. The card said, "We'd love to see you, Daphne. It's been too long." No apology. No mention of what came before. Just the polite stiffness of people who want your attendance without your anger. I went. I packed my overnight bag, pressed my best navy dress shirt, bought a bottle of single malt I knew my father loved but never treated himself to, and drove the 6 hours to my childhood home, all the while trying to rehearse how to be calm, how to be distant but polite, how to protect myself without shutting down completely. I didn't want to fight. I wanted, I don't know, maybe a crack of light. But the moment I stepped into the house, I felt it, the shift in air, the subtle tightening of faces, the way conversations paused a beat too long when I entered the room. Heather was already there, draped across the couch like a princess returned to her palace. Daniel close by with his performative smile and quiet eyes that always seemed to see more than he let on. My mother came from the kitchen with a forced brightness, arms outstretched as if hugging me was some long-lost ritual she'd remembered at the last minute. "Daphne, you look, well, so busy, I'm sure." I smiled, nodded, handed my father the bottle, watched his eyes flicker with a rare, brief appreciation before he set it on the counter without a word. And just like that, I was back in my role, the visiting specter, the one who never quite belonged. Dinner was worse. The conversation was monopolized by Heather, who recounted her latest brand consulting gig like she was unveiling state secrets, and every time I tried to contribute, it was met with polite nods, soft interruptions, or Heather's favorite tactic, reframing. If I said something about a recent breakthrough at work, she'd quickly follow with a story about a client who had a biotech startup connection, turning my achievement into her anecdote. At one point, when I tried to mention the patent my team had just secured, she leaned over her wine glass and said, "It's so wild you're still doing that lab stuff. I thought you'd pivot by now. Like, into something broader." I froze for a moment, fork suspended midair, and looked at her, really looked. Her face was too smooth, her tone too casual, but her eyes were daring me. I could either let it slide or ruin the night. I let it slide. Until it sat. Because that's when it came out, the real reason I'd been invited, the bombshell masked as family discussion. We were sipping coffee when my mother pulled out a manila folder and placed it in front of me, like she was handing over a contract I'd been expected to sign. "We've made some final decisions regarding the Montana property," she said, without making eye contact. "Heather and Daniel will be managing it going forward. They've already started renovations." "Oh." I stared at her, the words not sinking in at first. "I thought we hadn't finalized anything," I said slowly. "Well," she began, glancing briefly at Heather. "We assumed you wouldn't be interested in taking on that kind of responsibility. You live so far, and you're very focused on your career." I laughed, soft and disbelieving, more exhale than sound. "So, it's done. Without even asking me?" Heather set down her cup with a too loud clink. "You always make things so dramatic. It's not like we're cutting you out." "You did cut me out," I said, voice steady now. "And don't pretend like this was some logical choice. You never even asked." Daniel, to his credit, stayed quiet. My father looked away. My mother's mouth tightened into that thin line she wore whenever someone challenged her sense of order. "It's what makes the most sense," she said. "No," I said, and this time my voice rose, just a fraction. "It's what you wanted. What Heather wanted. And I'm tired of pretending I haven't seen the pattern, how I get left out of decisions, how you talk about me instead of to me. How every accomplishment I've had gets shrugged off while Heather gets a standing ovation for showing up. The silence after that was the loudest thing in the room. I didn't cry. I didn't storm out. I just stood, calmly, heart pounding but face composed, and I looked at each of them, the family I had once fought so hard to belong to, and realized I no longer needed their validation. I didn't need a slice of land to prove my worth. I didn't need a title or a mention in a will or even their acknowledgement anymore. I just needed to be done. So I left. I packed my bag, walked out without dessert, and drove through the night. Headlights slicing through the darkness like a promise I didn't yet understand. It wasn't revenge I wanted. It was liberation. And I had just begun to taste it. I didn't cry in the car, not once during the 6-hour drive back to San Diego. Even though my hands trembled at every red light and my throat felt like it had been stitched shut with invisible thread, and even though there were moments, long moments, when the silence inside that car felt so thick I thought it might crush me. I just drove, eyes fixed on the road ahead, heart pounding in a rhythm that felt more like survival than forward motion, my mind replaying every word, every glance, every slight at that dinner table, as if trying to find the exact second I'd become the stranger in my own family. But it wasn't just that night, it was years. Years of sitting quietly while Heather was praised for things I had done first, or better, or with more grace. Years of being the fallback babysitter, the last-minute donor, the emotionally available yet perpetually unseen daughter who everyone expected to understand why she didn't get invited, thanked, or heard. It was a slow erosion, like waves wearing down a cliff. No single moment caused the collapse, but eventually, there was nothing left to stand on. When I finally got home, I didn't unpack. I didn't even take off my shoes. I sat on the floor in my kitchen, leaning back against the cabinet beneath the sink, legs pulled to my chest, staring at the humming refrigerator like it might have the answers no one else seemed interested in giving. The quiet was deafening. My apartment was too clean, too neat, too well kept because I had no one to mess it up, no chaos to balance the solitude, and in that moment, it didn't feel like independence or peace. It felt like absence. It felt like abandonment. I don't know how long I sat there before the tears finally came, but when they did, they came all at once, violent, gasping sobs that bent me forward and left salt stains on the knees of my jeans. The kind of crying that doesn't make noise at first, just heaves through the chest like your body's trying to empty itself of everything it's carried too long. I cried for the little girl who used to press her drawings into her mother's hands, only to watch them get tucked behind a grocery list. I cried for the teenager who worked 2 jobs in college while Heather maxed out credit cards and still came home to applause. I cried for the woman who built a life out of diligence and silence and who, somehow, still wasn't enough to warrant a single word of defense from her own parents. But mostly, I cried because I felt alone in a way I couldn't explain to Annie, not in a single on Valentine's Day way or a watching everyone else get married kind of way, but in the soul, deep, isolating realization that I had no real place in the world I came from. That the people who were supposed to know me best had never bothered to really learn me at all. And when I finally stopped crying, when my chest stopped shaking and my throat stopped burning and my body felt like it had been wrung out like a towel, I just sat there, empty. Not numb, not angry. Just tired. I didn't eat. I didn't turn on the lights. I slept on the couch that night without brushing my teeth, curled under a throw blanket like a child hiding from monsters that had already found her. The days after blurred together. I went to work, because it was the only place that didn't hurt. I showed up to meetings, gave presentations, answered emails, and smiled when I was supposed to. Even though something inside me felt irrevocably cracked. My coworkers asked if I was tired. I told them I was fine. I got coffee with Laurel, the woman in my department who'd become something close to a friend, and when she mentioned planning a weekend getaway with her sisters, I smiled and said, "That sounds amazing." Like I wasn't hollowed out by the weight of what I didn't have. I started questioning everything, every choice, every sacrifice, every effort to do things the right way. What had it earned me, really? A nice apartment no one visited, a savings account no one cared about, A life of competence and solitude while people like Heather got rewarded for chaos wrapped in charm. I kept wondering if I'd missed something vital about being loved, if maybe I'd spent so long trying to be worthy that I forgot how to ask for anything more than scraps. I watched the world go on without me, saw photos of Heather's new living room renovation on social media, read the family group chat's string of messages about planning Christmas in Montana, without once asking if I could come. And I sat in the dark, night after night, feeling like a ghost tethered to a name no one used unless they needed a favor or a fallback. At one point, I considered writing a long, emotional message, one last attempt to explain myself, to plead for understanding, but the thought made my stomach turn, because I already knew the ending. They wouldn't read it. Or worse, they would and still blame me for being too sensitive. They would say I was dramatic, ungrateful, that I was holding on to things that weren't that serious. I could hear their voices in my head, not from memory but from decades of repetition, and I realized that no message, no perfectly worded explanation, would rewrite the story they'd already chosen to believe. So I didn't write anything. I just got quiet. Quieter than before. Not because I didn't have things to say, but because I had no faith that anyone would listen. And in that silence, in that bottom of the well kind of aloneness, I started to hear something else, not their voices, not the ghosts of every time I'd been passed over or ignored, but something smaller, something that sounded a lot like my own voice, the one I hadn't trusted in years, whispering, "You deserve better than this." And though I didn't believe it, not yet, not fully, I wanted to. I needed to. Because if they weren't going to see me, then I'd have to start seeing myself. And that was the first quiet step toward the fight I didn't know I was ready to wage. It started not with anger, not with some grand plan for revenge or retribution, but with a spreadsheet, simple, clinical, color-coded, just me, at my kitchen table on a Tuesday night. Glass of wine untouched beside my laptop, staring at a 10-year record of everything I'd built while they weren't looking, while they were too busy watching Heather stumble forward and calling it charm. My entire adult life was there in cells and tabs and notes. Investments made during market dips, bonuses reinvested, modest stock gains grown carefully into something substantial. My net worth wasn't flashy, but it was undeniable, and for the first time, I didn't see it as a private victory, I saw it as proof. Proof that I had never been the failure they painted me to be. Proof that being quiet wasn't the same as being small. Proof that I'd spent years being underestimated by people who wouldn't know a Roth IRA from a recipe card. And somewhere in that moment, while scrolling through my brokerage account, I realized something that made my breath hitch in a way that was more awe than pain. I had outgrown them. Not just financially, but emotionally, intellectually, spiritually. The girl who had once begged for a place at the table no longer needed the meal. I had built a feast of my own. And yet, for all their judgment, for all the years they told the story of me as the one who just didn't get it, not a single person had ever asked what I did get, what I knew, what I carried, what I had been quietly building while they were laughing at me behind wine glasses and brunch menus. That's when the idea came, not out of spite, but from a deep place of clarity. I wasn't going to explain myself anymore. I was going to show them. Heather's birthday was coming up. I knew the family would be gathering for her party, likely catered, likely full of Instagrammable moments, likely with a cake that cost more than my rent in grad school. I wasn't invited, of course, but I didn't need an invitation to make an impression. I scrolled through my messages and found our last text exchange, the one where she called me selfish and cheap after I refused to fund her fitness studio fantasy, and without overthinking, without flinching, I hit attach photo, scrolled through my camera roll, and added the screenshot I'd taken earlier. My investment summary, front and center, $3.4 million across portfolios, a decade's worth of discipline compressed into a single image. And beneath it, I typed one word. Oops. End of section. No punctuation, just that. Clean, sharp, surgical. I sent it and set my phone down, heart pounding, not with fear, but with something electric, something like pride. Not arrogance, not cruelty, but a quiet declaration that I was no longer playing by their script. She read it immediately. 3 dots appeared, then disappeared, Then again, then nothing. I waited 10 minutes. Still nothing. And then finally a reply. "What is this?" I smiled. Because she knew exactly what it was. I didn't respond. 20 minutes later, she sent another message. "Is this real?" Still, I said nothing. Because the numbers didn't need a caption. The balance sheet didn't need a backstory. I wasn't offering an explanation. I was letting the truth stand on its own. The next morning, my mother called me. I didn't pick up. Then she texted, "Can we talk?" I waited an hour. Then I replied, "About what?" It took 2 more hours before she responded. "Heather is very upset." That message was unnecessary. And right there, it was confirmed my net worth, my financial success, my quiet triumph wasn't what disturbed her. It was the fact that I had dared to make it visible. The fact that I had disrupted the narrative. "So it's true then," I wrote back. "You all really believed I was the one who needed help." No response. Just silence. But the shift had happened. I could feel that something had ruptured, something old and brittle and long overdue. I wasn't the same Daphne they thought they knew. I wasn't the sister who would keep quiet. I wasn't the daughter who would always play nice just to earn scraps of affection. I was done. In the days that followed, I started saying no without cushioning it. I stopped answering group texts that didn't include me unless they needed something. I removed myself from the family WhatsApp entirely, didn't even announce it. I unsubscribed from their performance of family unity. But I also began something just for me. I contacted a financial advisor, not because I needed help managing my money, but because I wanted to learn how to use it. I wanted to grow it, direct it, shape it into something bigger than revenge. I started looking at philanthropic networks for women in STEM. I created an anonymous fund to sponsor low-income girls pursuing biotech degrees. I began writing again essays, letters, even a draft of a memoir I didn't know I had in me. Because that was the twist no one saw coming. I wasn't just pulling away. I was stepping into power. Not the loud kind. Not the Heather kind. But the steady, unshakable kind. The kind that doesn't beg for a seat. The kind that builds the table from scratch. It didn't happen in some grand courtroom scene, or over a family dinner where someone pounded their fists on the table, or in a dramatic storm of shouting and broken glass, because that's not how real life works. Not in my family, not in the way we've been taught to keep appearances polished even when everything underneath is crumbling. But when it did happen, when the confrontation finally came, it was just as brutal, just as raw. And maybe even worse because everyone was still smiling for the first 15 minutes. It was Thanksgiving, 6 weeks after I sent the screenshot and 1 week after I had declined the invitation to Montana, which had apparently rattled more cages than I expected, because my mother called and insisted that I come this time, that things were getting too distant, and that family is all we have in the end. Her voice clipped and vaguely desperate, like someone trying to patch a sinking boat with a paper towel. I said yes, not because I wanted to see them, but because I was done hiding from the people who taught me to hide. I arrived in a rental car, a sleek black hybrid that Heather would later accuse me of flaunting, though I had chosen it purely for comfort and silence because I knew I'd need both for what was coming. The house looked the same, painfully tidy, the porch decorated with neutral pumpkins and expensive wreaths, the scent of something over-roasted wafting out before I even reached the steps. I knocked once, out of habit, even though it was my childhood home. Even though I still remembered the sound the front door made when my dad came home from work. How I used to race down the hallway just to be near him, before I learned that presence doesn't always mean protection. Heather opened the door. She didn't smile, she didn't hug me. She just looked me up and down, her eyes landing on my wrist where I wore the same smartwatch I'd had for years, the one she once mocked as too utilitarian, and said, "Glad you could finally make time." I stepped past her without answering. Inside, the house was warm, almost too warm, and full of the noise of forced celebration glasses clinking, fake laughter. Football playing in the background like a metronome ticking off moments no one really lived in. My mother came forward, arms out like a reflex, hugging me quickly, briefly, her cheek cool and perfumed, and my father offered a soft grunt and a handshake, as if I were a guest instead of his daughter. I noticed the seating chart taped discreetly to the side of the fridge. My name was penciled in last, beside the end chair, the one with the back that wobbled slightly. Dinner began with toasts. Heather toasted gratitude for family that shows up. Away. Daniel toasted growth for investments that finally pay off, which I knew was aimed at me, though I smiled and lifted my glass like a seasoned politician, letting the sting settle quietly beneath my skin. And then, halfway through the dry turkey and overcooked carrots, Heather turned to me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes and said, "So, Daff, anything new in your world of, what is it, biotech spreadsheets?" I set down my fork, wiped my mouth with a napkin and said, "Actually, yes. I'm investing in early-stage therapeutics and funding scholarships for girls in STEM. And I just got approved for a real estate grant that'll double my equity next year." Silence. Long, strained silence. Daniel blinked. My mother tilted her head slightly, as if trying to translate a foreign language. Heather narrowed her eyes. "That's a lot of financial stuff, isn't it?" "Yes," I said, calmly. "And I've been doing it for a while. Quietly. Just like I've been quietly funding my own life, my own success, while you've all treated me like I needed handouts or advice on how to be more like you." There it was. The first crack. My mother cleared her throat. "No one ever said you weren't doing well, Daphne." "You didn't have to," I replied. "You said it by never asking. By never showing interest. By rewriting the will to favor the child who keeps making messes you call ambition. You said it every time you let Heather define me to people I've never even met." Heather's smile cracked wide open, bearing something sharp. "Don't you dare turn this into a victim speech." "I'm not," I said, voice still steady. "I'm turning it into a reckoning." Daniel leaned forward, perhaps sensing that this was no longer just a family squabble. "So, what do you want from this, Daphne? An apology? Money? Validation?" I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was finally so clear that they didn't understand me at all. I want none of that. I don't need what you think I need. I have my own life. I built it, while you were all too busy pretending I was failing. But I want this on record. I see what you did. And I won't pretend it didn't happen." Then I pulled out a folder. My own folder. One I had printed and bound myself, full of statements, records, letters from my foundation partners, photos of girls I was mentoring in labs across the country. I slid it across the table to my mother. She didn't touch it. "You made assumptions," I said, voice low but even. "You made choices about my value. And now I'm showing you the part of me you refuse to see." No one spoke for a long time. Then my father said, barely above a whisper, "I didn't know." And I believed him. But I didn't forgive him. Because not knowing wasn't an excuse. And in that moment, something shifted not in them, but in me. I realized that speaking up wasn't about changing them. It was about freeing myself. I stood, pushed in my chair, and said, "I'm done letting your ignorance define my worth." And I walked out. Not as a daughter, not as a sister, but as someone who finally understood what it meant to claim her place. I thought the silence would last forever after I walked out of that Thanksgiving dinner. Thought I'd sealed myself off from them completely, that whatever tiny, flickering thread of connection still remained had snapped for good. But something strange happened in the weeks that followed, something quiet and subtle. Like the first shift of weather before a storm or a season turning without fanfare. It wasn't remorse, not at first, not anything as grand or cinematic as a handwritten apology or a tearful phone call in the middle of the night. It was hesitation. Delay. A pause in the narrative they had once so confidently controlled. They stopped speaking about me with casual contempt. I know this because my cousin Lisa reached out of the blue, with a text that simply read, "Just heard what happened. About time." And I sat there, staring at her message, wondering how far the story had already traveled. How many people had watched me get sidelined for years and said nothing until now? until they saw I had finally had enough. The family, it seemed, had always known how the roles were stacked, but they had accepted the imbalance as natural, as deserved, until I forced them to see otherwise. The group chat grew quiet. The holiday planning emails lost my name. There was no birthday card for me that December, no polite invitation to the annual New Year's brunch, which, for the first time in years, I greeted not with bitterness but with relief. I spent New Year's Eve on a rooftop in the city, watching fireworks over the marina with Laurel and a few friends from the lab, laughing at jokes that had nothing to do with family guilt, sipping champagne that I had bought for myself, on my terms, with no one around to imply I didn't deserve it. And then on a Wednesday morning in mid-January, while I was halfway through reviewing a presentation on our newest cell linea letter arrived in my inbox. Not an email, a real letter. Scanned and forwarded from my parents' estate attorney. Subject line: Updated beneficiary designation. I opened the PDF with trembling hands, expecting more confirmation of my exclusion, more evidence that I had been demoted to footnote status in the only legacy I'd ever had a claim to. But instead, there it was. My name. Equal share, explicitly listed. With a note at the bottom. Amended per family discussion and beneficiary request. I sat there, stunned, unsure whether to laugh or cry or just close the file and pretend I hadn't seen it. Because I knew this wasn't love. This wasn't an apology. This was damage control. This was the aftershock of my confrontation echoing through the cracks I'd exposed in their perfect little hierarchy. But still something had shifted. They couldn't pretend anymore. They couldn't erase me without consequence. I had shown them what I was worth, and they had finally, grudgingly, adjusted their math. Heather, of course, was livid. She didn't call, she didn't write. But I heard from Lisa again, who had apparently spoken to Heather after the update was made, and she told me Heather had melted down, accusing everyone of pandering to me, of falling for some sob story, of letting Daphne manipulate the narrative. I smiled when I read that, because for years she had manipulated the narrative, and no one said a word. But the moment I took back control, it became manipulation in her eyes, because that's how people react when their power is no longer absolute. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Because the victory wasn't in the paperwork or the money, it was in the clarity, the undeniable truth that I had made them see me, even if they hated it, even if they resented me for it. They had built a system where silence equaled worthlessness, and I had broken that illusion by showing them just how powerful silence could be when it ends. Still, it wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about peace. About standing in the life I had built with my own two hands and finally realizing I didn't need their recognition to make it real. Their approval had once felt like oxygen, something I needed to breathe, but now, it was more like perfume, nice if it lingers, but completely unnecessary to survive. In February, I launched the scholarship officially, the Lee Initiative for Women in Biotech, and sent out the press release under my full name, Daphne Elise Lee, so no one would miss it. I didn't hide. I didn't minimize. And when I got the first email from a 17-year-old girl in Detroit who said she'd never imagined someone like her could end up in science, I cried harder than I had in months, not from grief, but from a kind of release, the purest kind, the kind that comes when you realize your pain has given you a power no one can take away. Heather tried to post a vague status about how some people use money to buy clout. Lisa sent me the screenshot. I didn't respond. Because Heather was still playing a game I had outgrown. My mother sent me a birthday card in March. It was short. It simply said, "Proud of all you've accomplished. Love, Mom." No apology. No elaboration. But for the first time, I didn't read it looking for what was missing. I just read it. And then I threw it away. Because I was finally learning to stop clinging to scraps. Because I had already given myself the validation they never could. Because I had already won. The days that followed were quiet, not in the way that silence once felt like abandonment, but in the way that peace settles after a long, relentless storm, when the air is still heavy with the memory of thunder, but the sky begins to clear, revealing a softness that had been hidden for far too long. I found myself waking up without the familiar weight in my chest, the one that used to press down before my eyes even opened, reminding me of all the ways I had been overlooked, misunderstood, and dismissed. Now, there was a lightness, tentative but real, as if my soul was finally exhaling after years of holding its breath. I began to reclaim the spaces in my life that I had once shrunk within, starting with my home. I painted the walls in colors that made me feel alive, deep blues that reminded me of the ocean's depth, warm yellows that captured the essence of sunlight filtering through leaves. I rearranged furniture, not for practicality, but to create nooks where I could curl up with a book, sip tea, or simply sit and be present with myself. Each change was a declaration. This is my space, my sanctuary, and I deserve to feel at home within it. Work took on a new dimension as well. I no longer saw it as a means to prove my worth to anyone else but as an extension of my passion and curiosity. I volunteered to mentor new interns, finding joy in guiding them through the complexities of biotech research, watching their eyes light up with understanding and excitement. Their fresh perspectives reminded me of why I fell in love with science in the first place, the endless possibilities, the thrill of discovery, the impact it could have on real lives. Outside the lab, I reconnected with old friends and made space for new ones. I hosted small gatherings, filled with laughter, music, and stories that flowed freely, unburdened by judgment or pretense. These moments, though simple, were profound in their authenticity. They were reminders that family isn't solely defined by blood but by the people who choose to see you, support you, and celebrate you for who you truly are. One afternoon, while organizing a box of keepsakes, I stumbled upon a letter from my father written years ago during my first semester in college. The paper was yellowed, the ink slightly faded, but his words were clear. "Daphne, I know I don't say it often, but I'm proud of you. Keep pushing forward." Reading it now, tears welled up in my eyes, not from sadness, but from a complex mix of emotions. It was a glimpse into a time when he saw me, even if fleetingly, and it reminded me that people are capable of change, of growth, even if it's slow and uneven. Inspired, I decided to write letters to each member of my family, not to reopen old wounds, but to share my truth, my journey, and my hopes for the future. In them, I expressed my feelings, my experiences, and my desire for genuine connection, should they be willing to meet me halfway. I didn't expect responses, but writing them was cathartic, a way to release lingering pain and make room for healing. To my surprise, my mother replied. Her letter was brief but heartfelt. "Daphne, thank you for your honesty. I'm sorry for the times I failed to understand you. I'd like to start anew, if you're open to it." Reading her words, I felt a cautious hope bloom within me. Rebuilding our relationship wouldn't be easy, but this was a small, significant step toward reconciliation. Heather's response came weeks later, in the form of a text message. "I read your letter. I have a lot to think about." It wasn't an apology, nor was it dismissive. It was an acknowledgement, and for now, that was enough. As spring approached, I found myself drawn to nature, seeking solace in its rhythms and cycles. I took long walks along the coast, the salty breeze and crashing waves grounding me in the present. I started a small garden on my balcony, nurturing herbs and flowers, watching them grow and thrive under my care. Each sprout, each bloom, was a testament to resilience, to the beauty that can emerge from patience and attention. In these moments of stillness, I reflected on my journey, the pain, the growth, the empowerment. I realized that while the scars remained, they no longer defined me. They were reminders of battles fought and lessons learned, of strength discovered in the depths of despair. And as I stood on the threshold of a new chapter, I felt ready not just to move forward, but to embrace the fullness of life, with all its complexities and wonders. If there's one thing I've learned through all of this, through the rejection and the silence and the small, invisible victories I had to clap for alone, it's that being right doesn't always feel like a win. And sometimes standing your ground means standing alone for longer than you ever thought you could endure. But eventually, there comes a moment when the ground beneath you no longer feels like exilate, feels like home. I used to think the pain of being misunderstood would lessen with time, that distance would soften the sharpness, that silence would soothe the sting. But I know now that pain only changes when we change the story we tell ourselves about it. When we stop waiting for others to validate our hurt and start holding space for our own truth like it's something sacred. I used to crave their recognition like it was the missing piece of my identity, as though if they finally saw me, finally acknowledged what I'd built, I'd become whole. But I was already whole, always had been. I just couldn't feel it beneath the years of second-guessing and the instinct to shrink myself to make others comfortable. They told me I was bad with money because they needed a story in which I was lesser, where Heather shined brighter, where my competence was threatening unless it stayed hidden. But competence doesn't go away when it's ignored, it just grows stronger in the dark, quieter, sharper, waiting for the moment when it no longer needs to ask for permission. And when that moment came, when I typed one word, sent one screenshot, and watched the narrative tilt on its axis. It wasn't about revenge, it wasn't about humiliation, it was about liberation, about finally placing myself at the center of my own life and saying, this is who I am. This is what I've done. And whether or not you approve, it's still real. I won't pretend that healing came all at once. There are still moments unexpected, quiet ones when the old ache returns, when I hear someone say family and feel that flicker of longing, that familiar question. What if they had chosen to love me better? But I let the question pass through me like wind through open windows. I don't close myself to it, but I no longer let it take root. I've stopped trying to fix what didn't break because of me. I've stopped handing out explanations like apologies. And I've started building a life that feels good on the inside, even if no one outside notices. I wake up and don't flinch when I see my reflection. I walk into rooms without bracing for dismissal. I speak and trust that my voice matters, even if it trembles. I live with the quiet confidence that comes not from being seen, but from no longer needing to be. To anyone who's been the lesser sibling, the overlooked child, the one written out of stories you were part of, please know this: your value does not depend on someone else's inability to see it. You don't need a seat at their table if you're building a better one of your own. And if you've spent years believing you are the problem, the burden, the disappointment, look again. Look at the life you've created, the resilience you've grown, the strength you carry. You are not a mistake. You are not too much. You are not too little. You are exactly enough. And if you ever reach that point, the one where you can finally hold up your life like a mirror to those who doubted you and say, not in bitterness, but in quiet triumph, oops, know that you're not being petty. You're just finally letting the truth speak louder than the lies. And that, my friend, is power.